Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
Hello and welcome to World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. Coming up, a Chinese white paper calls for working together to build a more just and equitable global governance system. G7 nations promise to support Ukraine in joint declaration. And we're going to explore what is really fueling panda-bound booms so far this year. China says it solves multiple drug cases based on American-provided intelligence. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on our previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. First up, China has released a white paper on the country's principles, proposals, and actions on global governance. Foreign Minister Wang Yi says China has consistently played an active role in global governance. He says China champions the building of a community with a shared future for humanity and takes the lead in practicing true multilateralism. The white paper notes that China proposed the Global Governance Initiative, or GGI, to promote a more equitable and just global governance system. It emphasizes safeguarding the international system with the UN at its core, the international order based on international law, and the fundamental norms of international relations based on the principles of the UN Charter. So for more, joining us now on the line is Dr. Wang Xingsong, Associate Professor at the School of Government, Beijing Normal University. So thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Wang Xingsong.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, according to this white paper we're discussing here, China promotes a global governance system characterized by extensive consultation, joint contribution for shared benefits, true multilateralism, equal and orderly multipolarity, a universally beneficial and inclusive economic globalization. So, why do you think China is working hard to promote these ideas? Is it precisely because they are increasingly, being challenged by trends taking place on the opposite side?
Exactly. I think China promotes these ideas because it does see today's global governance facing a real contradiction. On paper, the world already has the United Nations, the WTO, and international law and development institutions and so on. But in practice, if you look at it, many countries feel that global governance is becoming less equal, less inclusive, and less effective. So yes, these ideas are being promoted partly because the opposite trends are becoming stronger, right? Instead of extensive consultation, we sometimes see decisions being made by small groups of powerful countries. And instead of true multilateralism, we have seen selective multilateralism. And globalization is being dismantled to some extent by protectionism, tariffs, technology restrictions, and so on. So from China's perspective, this is very dangerous because the world's problems are increasingly global, but the responses are becoming more fragmented. And all these issues, global issues, cannot be resolved by one country. And all countries need to cooperate. And if major countries adopt the exclusive ideas of governance, then all these global issues are going to have even more challenges. So the white paper's language on extensive consultation and joint contribution reflects China's view that global governance should not be dominated by a few, but rather it should let more countries participate more actively and effectively.
After China or Chinese President Xi Jinping proposed this Global Governance Initiative, or GGI, last year, it quickly gained support from nearly 160 countries and international organizations. What do you think this tells us? And what do you think the GGI is aimed at addressing?
Well, it tells us that many countries are obviously dissatisfied with the current status quo of global governance. It does show that the initiative proposed by China speaks to a widespread feeling, especially across the global south, where, many feel that global system does not treat them fairly. So this dissatisfaction comes from various aspects. One is that many countries feel like underrepresented. They're affected by global rules on many issues, but when it comes to participation and influence, it's quite limited. Another aspect is that many countries feel that international law is not applied unevenly. It seems to be applied only selectively. Countries, especially the powerful countries, ask other countries to follow international law, whereas they themselves are not doing the same thing. Right. So all these what's happening in global governance as well international politics are making many countries feel that global governance system is very much in need for a reform. That's why when China rolled out the global governance initiative, it has received very widespread positive reaction. And it's also related to China's efforts to link legitimacy with effectiveness, right? Because a global governance system cannot be legitimate if most countries feel excluded. But if a global governance system cannot be effective, right, and it ends up only producing declarations and not solving problems, and people will also feel frustrated. So China is trying to tell the world that, we have a package of ideas and norms, but at the same time, if you look at what China's been doing, China has contributed tremendously to global governance over the past decades.
Yeah. So exactly talking about China's contributions, I mean, global governance is actually a very, very wide-ranging concept that covers the maintenance of global peace, global security, and boosting global development, especially economic development, and tackling common challenges like climate climate change, and some diseases. For example, right now there is an ongoing Ebola epidemic in Central Africa. So, what do you make of China's concrete contributions to each of those areas?
Yeah, you're absolutely right in pointing out that China's contribution goes into many layers of global governance because we're faced with many global issues than ever. For example, when it comes to peace and security, China, being a permanent member of the UN Security Council, has a special responsibility. For example, China often emphasizes dialogue, ceasefire, political settlement, and respect for sovereignty. And we have seen this in China's positions on various conflicts that are going on, including the conflicts in Ukraine, the Middle East, and other conflicts. But China is also a very large contributor to the UN peacekeeping. It is one of the largest financial contributors to the peacekeeping missions. It also sends the largest troops among the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. And on development, China has rolled out a global development initiative, but there are many concrete actions. Domestically, China's own poverty reduction is often cited as a major contribution to global poverty alleviation. But externally, China has promoted the Belt and Road Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, and South Cooperation, and so forth. In all these efforts, including financing on infrastructure and agricultural training and so on, are very important because many developing countries need such infrastructures like roads, electricity, and ports. They need capacity in public health, in ICT, and other areas. So development governance becomes very concrete when it comes to China's efforts. And then on climate change, China itself being a major emitter, but has contributed a lot in cutting the CO2 emission by trying to reach carbon neutrality and carbon peak. But more importantly, China has been spearheading the development of global green transition because China is a leading producer and adopter of solar panels, wind power, batteries, electric vehicles, and so on and so forth. So all these are important moves from the China side because it showcases to the rest of the world that a very large developing country can transition successfully and effectively to green technologies. And now China is trying to help the rest of the global south to also make the move in adopting green technologies. You talk about public health. I think China also is very demonstrating a lot of visible behavior and contribution on that regard as well.
Since you talk about the global south, that's exactly one major emphasis by this white paper we are talking about, right? It says more efforts are needed to enable global south voices to be heard. It also says China will always be a member of the global south. So how do you look at the way in which China positions itself in the global south, and why is China so committed to empowering global south in global governance?
I think it's helpful that we look at this issue from both historical and contemporary dimensions. Historically, China sees itself as part of the world that experienced colonialism, poverty, underdevelopment, and external domination, if not humiliation. So this historical memory is very important because China's diplomacy with Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Arab world has long emphasized sovereignty, independence, non-interference, and development. So when China says it is always a member of the global south, I understand that some parts of the world react kind of in a different way, that you're a successful economic power now, why are you still claiming yourself being part of the global south? But if you look at it from a historical perspective, China is not only referring to the current income levels, but also referring to this shared historical experiences and shared concerns about fairness in international politics. But with that said, however, China obviously is not an ordinary developing country. It is the second largest economy, right? A permanent member of Security Council and so on. So this gives China a special role in that it can speak from a developing country perspective, but at the same time, it has the capacity to provide resources, markets, technology, and diplomatic support to the rest of global South countries.
In terms of the China-US relationship, when China is ready, when China is willing to contribute more and to play a bigger role in global governance, do you think it is a good thing, or do you think it is a bad thing for the United States? I mean, how should the US government especially look at this trend?
Well, I think when China contributes more to global governance, it is not only a good thing for the US, it's a good thing for the entire world. I think for Washington, the key question is whether it interprets China's role mainly as a threat to US leadership or as a contribution to solving global issues. And by the way, both China and US are faced with these same global issues. So the US actually, I remember in 2005, the US high-ranked official asked China to be a more responsible stakeholder, but that was 20 years ago. And over the past 2 decades or so, China has been playing a much larger role in areas such as development finance, peace, climate technology, public health, and so on. Now Washington sees Beijing as a strategic competition, right? So if China's role helps stabilize conflict, reduce poverty, and expand infrastructure and so on, and then it objectively contributes to global public goods. And the US should welcome that, even if probably doesn't agree fully with what China is doing or the manner of how China is doing development on every issue. But at the same time, I think the US will naturally care about whether China's proposals are inclusive and transparent and all that. But at the end of the day, it should not oppose China's role automatically, because instead of opposing what China is doing, the US should join in hands in solving these problems collaboratively. Because at the end of the day, all these global issues are facing not only China, but the US. If the rest of the world settles in poverty, immigration, and hunger, and civil war, and so on and so forth, eventually everybody will suffer from the global issues. So instead of treating China as a threat and using the zero-sum mentality, the US can do a better job in helping China, in supporting China, in working with China on many of these global issues.
Thank you very much for joining us today. Dr. Wang Xingsong, Associate Professor at the School of Government, Beijing Normal University. You're listening to World Today. Stay tuned.
Hello, I'm Yin Liang, Kramer Chair Professor of Economics at Willamette University. In a rapidly changing world, staying informed has never been more important. World Today delivers sharp analysis, global perspectives, and the stories behind the headlines. It is your trusted source to understand what's shaping our world. World Today, bringing the world closer.
You're listening to World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. Days after the United States and Iran announced a framework deal for peace, what is actually in this particular deal remains unclear. No text of the deal has been made public so far. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said on Tuesday that the deal would require Israel to withdraw from Lebanon, a condition that Israel has already rejected. A senior Iranian general says the Revolutionary Guards of Iran is going to strike Israel if Israel continues to attack Lebanon. An American official in the meantime has said that the deal does not call for an automatic Israeli withdrawal. So joining us now on the line is Dr. Zhang Chuchu, Deputy Director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, Fudan University. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So the deal has not been made public so far, and officials belonging to different parties have sometimes offered, some sort of contradictory interpretations of what is actually in this deal. Why do you think this is the case?
Well, I think this could be a tactic of both sides because we know that a full public text could lead to immediate domestic and allied criticism. And on the contrary, if you have vague or phased language, this could allow both sides to claim victory at this stage to their audience. And also, another issue here is that contradictory statements are strategic signaling. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, his emphasis on Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon serves Tehran's narratives of resistance, of victory, and also I think he tries to link the bilateral U.S.-Iran track to the Lebanon front. So he keeps alarming and warning the United States and Israel that if you want to stop the war, it's not just with me, but also with my regional allies. However, United States officials denial that the deal mandates withdrawal. I think this actually aims to reassure its ally Israel and also to demonstrate to the Americans that they have not made significant compromise. So overall, I think this ambiguity buys time for the 60-day implementation window, while at the same time it tries to manage expectations.
Do you think Israel's refusal to withdraw from Lebanon might risk torpedoing this agreement?
Well, I think it carries a sort of uncertainty and variable for what's going to happen next, but it's not an automatic risk of derailment. While Iran has already explicitly framed continued Israeli operations in Lebanon as a violation of the MOU, at least that is what Araghchi has mentioned. And if Israel sustains major strikes or deepens its footprint, Iran says that it could respond by suspending cooperation or even delay nuclear talks or authorize limited actions. However, I think the deal is fundamentally a U.S.-Iran bilateral framework. So far, both Iran and the United States are desperately in need of an MOU. And Israel is not a signatory and has already claimed many times that it is not going to be constrained by this MOU. And I know that the United States holds a leverage over Israel, but in general, the United States is not going to use it since it also faces domestic and alliance constraints. So in general, I think limited targeted Israeli operations against Hezbollah reconstitution might be tolerated if they do not trigger broader Iranian retaliation.
Hmm. Talking about the situation in Lebanon, I mean, it's probably true that Hezbollah has been weakened by Israel's current military campaign in Lebanon. But do you think Hezbollah still retains the capability to strike Israel?
Well, I think so far, I would say Hezbollah in Lebanon, it has very limited capabilities, but it still retains the ability to make strikes. While Israel's operations since 2024 have actually inflicted heavy losses on Hezbollah in terms of its leadership, its command nodes, its rocket stockpiles, and also its infrastructure. Now the group is weaker than at its peak time during 2023 and early 2024. And it has already struggled with reconstitution under sustained pressure. Also, we know that the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria has already collapsed, which means that Hezbollah right now, it has lost crucial allies and logistic supports in neighboring countries. Nevertheless, Hezbollah still possesses thousands of rockets and drones and underground infrastructure. So I think it has also already demonstrated post-ceasefire firing capability in response to Israeli attacks.
I see. Pakistan represents a very important mediator between Washington and Tehran. And in a Tuesday phone call with his Pakistani counterpart, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi said that the current consensus reached by the US and Iran is far from the end of the process, but rather a new starting point. So, Dr. Zhang, do you agree that negotiations for the next stage are likely to be much more difficult than those leading to the first phase MOU?
Well, absolutely. And I think that is for sure, because the current MOU is largely a symbolic deal to show that both sides have something to show to their audience and they have the intention to de-escalate the conflict and to negotiate between themselves. But actually, the fundamental differences between the two sides remain there. And instead of finding a solution for these disputes, they leave them to a later stage of the negotiation. So it means that it is full of unpredictabilities. Right now, there are still a lot of fundamental differences about the key issues. For instance, Iran's nuclear program, regarding the enrichment levels, the stockpile disposition. Neither side has reached a resolution. And also there is the problem of sequencing and the scope of sanctions relief versus verifiable compliance. And also, like we have already discussed, Iran has always suggested that the ceasefire should be between Israel, the United States, and also the Iranian-led resistance force in the Middle East in general. However, Israel does not seem to be willing to stick to this point. So I think these are far harder because they touch core red lines for all parties at the moment. And it requires, intrusive verification that both sides distrust. So I think it's for sure that the later stage is going to be more difficult.
So, considering the current situation for which you have elaborated, what do you think the international community can do to facilitate the peace process? 1 minute.
Well, I think in general, the international community's leverage is very limited, but it can contribute to the peace process in several ways. For instance, the most important issue here is the humanitarian and reconstruction support for the region, because a lot of people, they become homeless, a lot of countries have already suffered from huge losses. So I think providing humanitarian aid to the region could indirectly support the broader ceasefire deal. And also, I think there should be more incentives and pressure on spoilers. So I think the international community should be very serious that violations could carry costs. Last but not least, I think it's also important to call for the big powers to avoid zero-sum framing at this stage.
Thank you very much for joining us and for your perspectives. Dr. Zhang Chuchu, Deputy Director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, joining us from Fudan University. You're listening to World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. We'll be back after a very short break. You're back with World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. The leaders of the Group of Seven have vowed to increase pressure on the Russian economy. They adopted a statement on Wednesday to tighten sanctions on the Russian oil and gas sector. The G7 leaders have also pledged to step up supplies of air defense system and long-range missiles and weapons to Ukraine. U.S. President Donald Trump urged Moscow to make a deal, quote-unquote, after meeting with his Ukrainian counterpart Volodymyr Zelensky at the G7 summit. So for more, my colleague Gao Yingshi spoke with Dr. George Zagopoulos, Senior Research Fellow joining us from CIFE, a European research organization.
European leaders sounded notably upbeat at the summit, with von der Leyen declaring the tide is turning for Ukraine and German sources saying that Russia cannot win the war. How do you read this renewed sense of confidence?
There is a war which is ongoing for more than 4 years, and it seems that no side can decisively win this war. I would say that from a European perspective, the European Union attempts as much as possible to support Ukraine. This is the main reason why President of the European Commission shared these remarks during the G7 summit. The conflict itself is persisting, and it is practically impossible to have practical information about what is happening in the battlefield. But it seems that after 4 years and a half, no side can decisively claim a victory in a manner that will lead this war into an end.
After meeting Zelensky, Trump said Russia should make a deal and promised to do whatever he can, but Trump gave no detail on what he's going to do. Do you think Ukraine has secured the greater U.S. support it wants?
President Trump is dealing with this issue for approximately 16 months, and he has met several times with President Zelensky, and while he has a constant communication with President Putin. He attempts to mediate and solve this conflict, but so far his attempts have not been successful. I would say that the United States is constantly supporting Ukraine, and I see no major change in the American approach. So far, the President of the United States has failed to bring this war to an end, as he had said in his pre-election campaign. So we have to wait and see, but we have to be also very careful because he has made many promises, and practically it's very difficult to mediate and solve the problem, which had started obviously before his victory in the American election.
Germany, France, Britain, and Ukraine tabled 5 conditions for a just and lasting peace, including a ceasefire and a European seat at the table. Yet Trump is unlikely to accept preconditions. Is this a roadmap, or Europe is trying to avoid being sidelined?
Yes, this is a very important question. This is the standard policy of the European Union and of the most powerful EU member states to be part in the negotiations, because the European Union last August felt a little bit frustrated that it had been excluded during the meeting of President Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in Anchorage. The European Union attempts as much as possible to persuade the United States to be part in the negotiations, but at the same time also it needs to play a role as far as future deliberations are concerned. So far, I have not seen much progress in negotiations, and that's why I am a bit moderate in comments I made because this issue has been on the public agenda for more than 15 months, while the European efforts and the European position has been very clear without the results that the European Union had hoped for. We have to wait and see, but it seems that is a problem that can be very hardly solved in the short and the medium term.
The summit unfolded just as the US and Iran struck a framework deal, and 4 G7 nations have signaled that they are ready to lift sanctions in response to step on Iran's nuclear program. How do you read Europe's calculation here, and what's at stake for G7 in this deal?
Well, EU member states attempt as much as possible to keep transatlantic relations stable, but it is very difficult for this to happen because President Trump makes his own calculations. As far as Ukraine is concerned, the most important priority for the European Union is to make sure that no deal will be reached that will undermine the European strategic interests. But obviously, transatlantic relations go beyond the Ukrainian crisis itself. And the most important priority for the European Union is, as much as possible, to keep the situation as it is and wait for the midterm election in the hope that more checks and balances will apply in the United States with a victory of the Democrats in the midterm elections, as several European countries are wishing for.
For all the talk of great transatlantic unity, the cracks were hard to miss. European leaders went to considerable length to keep Trump on side, and the US has scaled back its arms support to Ukraine while pulling troops out of Germany. So beneath the surface, how deep do you think the divisions within the G7 really run?
Well, there are certainly differences in the European and the American approach about Ukraine security guarantees, for example, together with the future foreign policy orientation of Ukraine are on the agenda. At the same time, the European Union is very much concerned about the European future of Ukraine. So far, no final decision has been made up to what extent and when Ukraine could enter the European Union. But still, from a European perspective, the United States remains the most important security actor and the country which is guaranteeing the security of the European continent. And this is certainly perplexing negotiations in a period during which President Trump obviously has his own foreign policy priorities, which are not necessarily in line with what European countries like Germany want to achieve. So conversations are continuing, but at the same time, we should not forget disagreements over the last 16 months.
In your opinion, what kind of policy the Europe or maybe the G7 should hold to bring this conflict to an end?
Well, it is extremely difficult to see how this war could end because there are different proposals. It is certainly an issue which is being negotiated with the United States and Russia, and at the same time with the United States and Ukraine. The role of the European Union is important, but at the same time, the European Union is not the most important actor in the conflict itself. So what the European Union attempts to achieve is to play a role in terms of how peace might be guaranteed, but obviously for this to happen, the war first needs to end. And we are not there yet. What we are exploring is that the European Union attempts as much as possible that the war could end in a manner that will not strategically benefit Russia and its own national strategic and general interests as far as the Ukraine conflict is concerned.
Well, that was Dr. George Zagopoulos, Senior Research Fellow of CIFE, a European research organization, speaking with my colleague Gao Yingshi. Coming up, we will explore what is fueling panda-bound boom so far this year. This is World Today. We'll be back.
Welcome. I am Chu Zhang, Deputy Director at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Fudan University. On the World Today program, we will dive beyond the headlines to uncover the stories, trends, and impacts that connect states across the globe. Join me on World Today.
You're back with World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. China's panda bond market is seeing strong growth so far this year. Since January, the total issuance of panda bonds has exceeded 130 billion yuan, nearly double the level seen a year ago. In the first quarter alone, issuance rose by more than 100% year on year. Panda bonds are renminbi-denominated bonds issued by overseas financial institutions in China's domestic market. This year, more foreign governments, banks, and multinational corporations are turning to panda bonds to raise funds. The trend comes as global investors increase their holdings of renminbi assets and several international institutions raise their forecasts for China's economic growth. With more, my colleague Zhao Yang earlier spoke with Dr. Yan Liang, professor of economics with Willamette University.
So, Professor Yan Liang, thank you very much for joining us. Since the beginning of this year, panda bond issuance has surged dramatically compared with a year ago. So, what are the main factors driving this strong growth, and why are foreign governments, banks, and multinational companies turning to panda bonds to raise funds in China?
Well, I think that we're seeing, as you mentioned, a mix of issuers this year. They include, sovereign and supranational entities like Kazakhstan and Pakistan's governments, as well as Slovenia, and also repeated issuers like Hungary. They're issuing the panda bonds. And you're also seeing the multinational development banks like New Development Bank and Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. They are also the frequent issuers. You're also seeing global financial institutions, especially like Deutsche Bank. They made a headline this year with record-breaking 5.5 billion yuan issuance. And there are also many other financial institutions like Morgan Stanley, BNP Paribas, and so on. And also multinational corporations, Volkswagen, BMW, and many others are the notable corporate issuers. So I think to answer the question why panda bonds attract such a wide varieties of issuers, I think the reasons are mostly, for one, the panda bonds offer really attractive low financing cost for foreign investors to borrow yuan. And second is that China's domestic bond market is large with very deep liquidity pool. So that attracts foreigners to tap into the liquidity pool. And I also think that many of the issuers, because they have their operations in China, they can fund the local projects directly in RMB. So to mitigate, currency risk, there is the interest to issue, RMB bonds to borrow in the yuan. And in addition to the three major reasons that I talked about above, I think there's also many diversification needs. Companies wanted to, borrow yuan and invest in yuan-denominated assets to diversify, their wealth management or to diversify their investments. And I think that the Chinese government also had recently simplified the capital remittance regulations. So according to all the regulatory updates, I think it allowed the foreign issuers to limit funds back to their global headquarters more easily. So given all these, I think that the panda bonds are increasingly attractive for foreign investors and issuers.
And how are panda bonds helping to promote the international use of RMB?
Well, I think it helps to promote RMB internationalization, at least for four different reasons. One is that it allows RMB to be a major financing tool. So in other words, when companies are looking for liquidity, they're looking for credit, they can now issue panda bonds to get RMB as a way to get their financing. And as I mentioned earlier, RMB financing has a much lower cost than other equivalent bonds like euro bonds and dollar bonds. So that's how this kind of low cost of financing becomes very attractive. And the second, I think, reason that panda bonds help with RMB internationalization is, as I mentioned earlier, it helped to create more liquidity, and this liquidity is denominated in yuan. And the third reason is that I think it helped boost RMB denominated assets, both as a safe haven reserve assets, but also for diversification, to add to corporations or investors' portfolio. So again, if the investors get the RMB raised by issuing panda bonds, they can invest their RMB into yuan denominated assets. So that again allowed them to acquire safe assets in the forms of the RMB in the forms of panda bonds. So this would then spare the global investors from taking corporate credit risk, for instance. I think this is also very important. In a way, when companies or sovereign governments issue panda bonds, they have to upgrade their operations to handle RMB clearing, underwriting, settlements, and so on and so forth. So in a way, it kind of compel global financial infrastructure to integrate RMB operations in their system. So that really helped to build this kinds of RMB settlement, RMB cross-border payment infrastructure. So that would also help to promote the RMB international uses.
And we've seen green and tech-focused panda bonds are gaining momentum. So why are investors showing strong interest in these areas? And what does it tell us about where the global capital sees long-term opportunities in China?
Right. So I think the green and the tech, largely, again, one is that I think the Chinese government has the interest to promote these kinds of bonds, right, for the green causes or to promote more technological innovations. So I think there is a strong policy support and the kind of regulatory environment to welcome the kind of issuance. And second, I think it's really, as China now becoming the sort of powerhouse, right, for both green tech, but also for technological innovations, I think companies are very much into, joining the kind of momentum, right? They wanted to also develop their own, green technologies and, promote technological innovations in general. So how to finance those undertakings is to, issue RMB denominated panda bonds, so they can raise RMB financing, they can invest in China's bonds market in terms of those green bonds and tech bonds. And so I think that really indicates that there is a confidence in China's green industry and its tech. And also, I think that would attract more foreign investors to partake in that profitable opportunities to develop green energies and technologies in China.
And at a time of global economic uncertainty and market volatility, what does the growing popularity of panda bonds tell us about the international confidence in China's economy and the financial markets?
Well, I think, first of all, in terms of issuing panda bonds itself, it shows there is the confidence in the stability of the RMB. Because if you issue RMB bonds and when RMB appreciates, that means your servicing cost is going to rise. So I think there is the confidence that the RMB will remain steady. It is, going to appreciate, but in a very graduate and very, steady manner. So I think there is a confidence in the RMB and in China's financial system in general. And second is, I think there is a trust, right, in China's onshore liquidity, that it's not likely that there will be some kind of liquidity crunch or any sort of dry out in liquidity. So I think that's another reason why issuers wanted to issue panda bonds and raise RMB denominated, to raise the funds in RMB. And another reason I think is, again, when you raise the RMB, most of the time you would invest those RMB within China's market. Of course, there are some investors, they raise RMB funds and then they convert it into dollars or euros or other currencies. But still, I think many of the investors, they issue the panda bonds to raise the Chinese yuan to invest in the Chinese onshore markets. So I think that, again, indicates there is the confidence in China's real economy, right? Its growth, as well as its financial system. So bonds, stocks, and other financial instruments are likely, to gain value. There are good investment opportunities. So I think that overall indicate that investors are confident in China's economic growth and financial stability, and also financial opportunities within China's markets.
Dr. Yan Liang, professor of economics, joining us from Willamette University, speaking with my colleague Zhao Yang. You're listening to World Today. We'll be back. You're listening to World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. China says anti-drug authorities of China and the United States are maintaining sound cooperative relationships. The National Narcotics Control Commission said on Wednesday that Chinese authorities have solved a number of cases based on information and intelligence provided by the U.S. The commission said China has cooperated with the U.S. in multiple areas, including substance scheduling, chemical control, intelligence exchange, and joint case investigations. By the end of 2025, China had placed 47 precursor chemicals under its control, including 7 fentanyl precursor chemicals. So for more, joining us now on the line is Professor Jia Daozhong from the School of International Studies, Peking University. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor.
You're welcome.
So first of all, is what the Chinese authorities are describing here consistent with your own observation? And if we are talking about a situation where there is really sound U.S.-China cooperation in this field, what would you attribute this sound cooperation to?
Well, before I answer this question, it's useful to point out that the number of chemical ingredients that can be called precursor chemicals that can be used, in other words, those chemical components that can be put together into fentanyl or other illicit drugs are numerous. Those 47 are based on postmortem investigation, and based on a scientific evaluation, and also based on international recognition. Now, there are many, many more chemicals that can be turned into precursors, but nevertheless, the 47 is internationally recognized as well. Now, to answer your question, what attributed to a smooth cooperation or sound cooperation? Because the symptom, in other words, the bad misuse of fentanyl as a product is primarily in the United States and some in Canada, not so much in Europe, actually, if you attribute that to income. Cooperation really, the momentum begins with what the U.S. government may see as effective.
Yeah.
So the history of cooperation on fentanyl is rather short. It corresponds to the identification of fentanyl as a leading cause of unnatural death in the U.S. So the Chinese side has been consistent, but for the U.S. side, the first Trump administration focused on the supply side and started to couple this with diplomatic embargoes and then bring in a foreign policy element to this when it comes to China. Now, the second, after the first Trump administration, the Biden administration focused on what's called harm reduction. In other words, they focused on providing Narcan and other kind of other medications to treat, and in other words, to help people recover. So the Trump administration, for the Biden administration, to get China to cooperate with the United States in terms of disciplining the criminals, or cross-border criminal networks, was at best a secondary issue. So they were happily, I wouldn't say happy, let me take that back. They were more into the kind of political practice of name and shame in China. But now we're talking about the second Trump administration, which is identified. Some of that is revealed in the report here by China. That's a professional report. And but I'm happy to see that the U.S. side has now changed from treating this as more of a political instrument or more of a diplomatic leverage, moved from that to treating this, calling a spade, and working on evidence-based cooperation.
So, in your understanding, Professor Zhang, across multiple fronts for anti-drug cooperation, what kind of operational level challenges do Chinese and American law enforcement agencies usually encounter?
Well, you have the usual challenge of different laws. And in addition to that, the U.S. and China have very low levels of judiciary cooperation. We don't have a treaty on extradition. We don't, the actual treaty-based cooperation is primarily on verification of documentary evidence, which is very slow. That's very, very low level. Point one. Point two is you have to bear in mind the international drug market is global. It's not a China-U.S. issue. And the proliferation, the deployment of, today we call AI, before that was internet or telecom communications technologies, can greatly help those criminal networks to evade usual police surveillance. And along with that, you have cryptocurrency. In other words, these drug dealers or producers, illegal traders, they do this for the money. Now they can pay each other, they can get, turned using cryptocurrency. They can also turn cryptocurrency into other real currencies. So everything said, I think the internet element or the technology element is new. And that leads to, coupled with what I said earlier about the low level of judiciary cooperation, it's very difficult. It's challenging. It takes a lot of devotion to the work, to the job, to produce evidence that can go through, live up to the standards of legal law enforcement in both countries.
So, Professor, how do you think China and the United States can maintain a professional anti-drug partnerships that will be somehow less affected by the fluctuation of the broader bilateral ties? Briefly.
The U.S. has, for the first time in recent years or recent decades, repatriated suspected Chinese criminals or fugitives to China. And this is a major improvement. So in other words, our police, law enforcement forces don't have to deal with those fugitives who trade in drugs, who can successfully, in reality, get a political protection in the United States by seeking political asylum or other means of evading laws on both sides.
Thank you very much for joining us. Professor Jia Daozhong joining us from the School of International Studies, Peking University. That's all the time for this edition of World Today. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. I'm Ding Han in Beijing. Thank you so much for listening. Bye for now.